Clara Bennett walked the last 3 miles into the Whitmore ranch yard with her boots worn through at both heels and a tin cup tied to her belt that had not held coffee in 4 days. It was late August of 1884. The grass gone the color of old rope, and the Whitmore spread sat 40 miles north of Cheyenne in Wyoming territory, with more cattle on it than the ranch had hands to work, and fewer decent meals in its kitchen than it had cattle. The men in the yard stopped what they were doing to look at her. She did not look like much to stop for. Her calico dress had been mended so many times it had lost any pattern it once carried. Her hair hung loose in a plain braid over one shoulder, and she carried nothing but a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth and the clothes on her back. She stopped at the edge of the yard, where a dozen tired cowhands stood around a cook fire gone half to ash, and she said plain and without apology that she would cook their supper if they would let her eat a plate of it herself. What she did not say, because she had learned some things are better shown than told, was that she had once fed 50 drovers a day out of a stone hearth on the Oregon Trail, before the drought took the way station and her father both. The ranch foreman looked her over, the way a man looks over a horse he has already decided not to buy, and laughed. His name was Garrett Cole, and he had run the Whitmore Outfits crew for 6 years, and he had a laugh that other men fell in behind the way cattle fall in behind a lead steer. "You'll cook our supper," he said, looking at her boots, her hollowed cheeks, the sharp bones of her wrists where the sleeves had ridden up. "Lady, you look like you ain't cooked yourself a meal in a month. What are you fixin' to feed 20 hungry men on dust and prayer?" The men behind him laughed too quick and easy, the kind of laugh that needs no real reason once somebody else has given it permission. And one of them, a heavy-set hand named Hank Brody, added that she looked more like she needed feeding than any woman he'd ever seen offer to do the feeding. And that got a bigger laugh than Garrett's had. Clara Bennett did not flinch. She had heard worse than this in 4 days of walking, had been turned off 2 other ranches and a stagecoach relay before this one, and she had learned that a woman standing at the edge of a yard asking for work had exactly 2 things she could control, which were her face and her feet, and she kept both steady. She said nothing further. She simply stood there, the bundle in her arms, and waited with the patience of someone who had run out of other places to be. It was Elias Whitmore who came out of the barn at the sound of the laughing, wiping his hands on a rag. A tall man of 45 with a sun-cracked face and the particular tiredness of a rancher who has not slept a full night in 2 weeks. He took in the scene without needing it explained to him, the ragged woman, the grinning hands, and he was tired enough and the ranch was hungry enough that he did not laugh along. He had buried his cook's usefulness, if not the man himself, 11 days earlier, when old Jasper Quinn's hands had shaken too badly to hold a skillet steady, a palsy that had come on him slow over the winter and gone fast once the heat of summer roundup hit. And since then, the crew had been living on burnt beans, scorched coffee, and biscuits hard enough to use as gate hinges, cooked in rotating and increasingly resentful shifts by whichever hand drew the short straw that day. Elias Whitmore had 140 head to brand before the week was out, and a crew that was one bad meal away from open mutiny, and he looked at the ragged woman standing in his yard and did not see, as Garrett did, a joke. He saw mostly a problem he did not have time to solve and could not afford to ignore. "You know your way around a kitchen," Elias said. It was not quite a question. "I do," Clara said. "Where'd you learn it?" She considered the question the way she considered most things, carefully before spending words on it. "My father kept a way station on the trail west of Fort Laramie for 14 years, she said. "I cooked at his side from the time I was 9 years old until the drought closed the trail and closed him along with it 3 years back. I have fed 50 men in a sitting more times than I could count for you. I'm not asking for charity, Mr. Whitmore. I am asking for the chance to prove I am worth my keep before you decide I am not." Garrett Cole snorted. 50 men on a wagon road ain't the same as feeding a workin' ranch crew on branding week, ma'am. Begging your pardon. These men have been eating burnt beans 2 weeks running, and they are meaner than snakes about it. You'll set that kitchen on fire inside an hour. Then I will owe you a kitchen, Clara said, and something in the flatness of it, the total absence of pleading, made even Hank stop laughing for a moment. Elias Whitmore looked at her a long moment, the way a man looks at a fence line he is deciding whether to trust. And then he looked past her at his crew, unwashed and underfed and sullen, and he made the kind of decision tired men make, which is the decision that costs the least to be wrong about. "One meal," he said. "Supper tonight. If it's fit to eat, we'll talk about tomorrow. If it ain't, you'll have a plate same as everybody else and a place to sleep in the hayloft tonight. And you'll be on your way in the morning with what provisions I can spare." "That's fair, I think, and it's more than most would offer." "It's more than fair," Clara said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Elias said. "Thank me if there's anything left worth eating when you're done." The crew had reason enough to be sour about food, and Elias knew it better than anyone standing in that yard. 2 weeks of Jasper Quinn's shaking hands and worse successors had left the men eating things that barely deserved the name of supper, and there had already been talk, quiet but real among the older hands, about riding on to an outfit that fed its men properly. Talk that would cost Elias Whitmore dearly in the middle of branding season, if it turned into more than talk. A ranch that could not feed its crew, could not hold its crew. And a ranch that could not hold its crew during roundups stood to lose more cattle to strays and bad counts than a man could afford in a single bad year. It was Eli Turner, the youngest hand on the place at 19, who broke from the group first, not to laugh, but to fetch a dipper of water from the trough and hold it out to Clara without a word. The kind of small, unthinking kindness a boy offers before he has learned to weigh whether kindness might cost him standing among older men. Clara took it and drank and thanked him, and Eli, embarrassed suddenly at having stepped out of line with the rest of the crew's mood, ducked his head and retreated back toward the others. And nobody remarked on it, though Garrett Cole noticed and filed it away without knowing quite why. Garrett's harshness that morning had a history behind it that nobody standing in the yard would have guessed at, least of all Clara. 4 years earlier, on a different outfit, Garrett had vouched to his own foreman for a cousin of his wife's who claimed cooking experience and turned out to have almost none. And the man's carelessness with a batch of undercooked pork during a roundup had put 2 hands flat on their backs with fever for the better part of a week. One of them badly enough that the outfit's owner had come within a breath of losing him. Garrett had carried the blame for that vouching ever since, had been demoted from a position of trust for the better part of a year afterward, and had promised himself he would never again let a stranger's claim about a kitchen go untested before the whole crew's well-being rode on it. It made him quick and hard with newcomers in a way that had nothing to do with the newcomers themselves, and everything to do with a week 4 years gone that he had never quite set down. And it was this, more than any real judgment of Clara Bennett's worth, that had put the meanness in his laugh that morning. She was given the ranch kitchen, which was a low log building set apart from the bunkhouse, with a great stone hearth at one end and a cast-iron range that Jasper Quinn had never quite mastered, and had in his last weeks come to actively fear. The larder was thin, the ordinary thinness of every larder on the frontier, in high summer, before the fall slaughter, before the garden came in full, before the supply wagon made its next run to Cheyenne. There was salt pork gone half to rind, a sack of cornmeal, a smaller sack of flour going stale at the bottom, dried apples in a tin, a crock of sorghum molasses, wild onions somebody had gathered and forgotten about, a half barrel of beans, and coffee grounds so fine and reused so many times it had gone the color of dishwater. It was not much. Clara Bennett looked at it the way another woman might have looked at a room full of silver, and she rolled up what remained of her sleeves, and she began. Word had gotten around the yard fast, as word does on a ranch where there is little enough to talk about besides weather and cattle, and by mid-afternoon most of the crew had found some excuse to walk past the kitchen window. What they saw if they looked was a ragged woman, working with a stillness and an economy of motion that did not match the joke they had already decided she was. She did not fumble. She did not waste. She rendered the rind from the salt pork slow over a low fire until the kitchen filled with a smell that made 2 hands find sudden, urgent business near the woodpile outside the window, and she used the rendered fast to work through the stale flour and what butter she found gone half rancid at the bottom of a crock, salvaging enough of it with a spoonful of the sorghum to make it worth keeping. She soaked the beans that had been sitting since morning in water gone cloudy with age, changed the water twice, and set them to simmer slow with the salt pork rind. A bay leaf she had, unbelievably to anyone watching, found growing wild along the creek bank that morning on her walk in, having recognized it by smell the way another person recognizes a face she had learned growing up on the trail, that a hungry man does not need fine food. He needs food cooked by someone who understands hunger, who has stood over a fire herself with nothing in her stomach, and knows exactly what a plate needs to say to a person who has been afraid in some old animal part of himself that no one was going to feed him. Her father had told her that the year she turned 12, standing over the same kind of thin larder, in the same kind of desperate circumstance, feeding 40 travelers on a wagon train that had lost half its provisions to a river crossing gone wrong. Cook for the fear, Clara, he had told her, not just the hunger. A man who is only hungry needs calories. A man who is afraid needs to taste that somebody in this world still cares whether he eats well. She had never forgotten it. And she did not forget it now, standing in a strange kitchen on a ranch that had already decided she would fail cooking for 24 strangers who had laughed at her boots. The way station had been called Harlan's Rest, a name her father had chosen, half in earnest and half as a joke on himself, since rest was the one thing a man running a trailside kitchen for 14 years rarely got. It burned in a single night during the drought summer, a cook fire jumping its ring in wind that had not let up in 6 weeks. Taking the stone hearth's timber roof, the smokehouse, and most of what stores they had put by against the coming winter. Her father had gone back in twice for what he could carry, and come out the second time with his lungs half ruined by smoke. And he had never fully drawn an easy breath again before the pneumonia took him that January. Clara had buried him on a hillside above the ruined station with her own hands, because there had been no one left to hire for the digging, and she had walked away from that hillside 3 years later, still able to name every person who had passed through Harlan's Rest with a full stomach and a dry bed, and unable to name a single soul in all her walking since who had offered her the same, without first deciding by the look of her that she deserved neither. 2 ranches before the Whitmore place had turned her away outright, one foreman telling her plainly that he did not hire drifters he could not vouch for, the other simply closing a door before she had finished asking. And a stagecoach relay station had let her sleep one night in its barn and sent her on at first light, without so much as a cup of coffee for the road. She had grown practiced by the time she reached the Whitmore yard at absorbing a closed door without letting it slow her feet. But practice was not the same as it costing nothing, and something in her had gone very quiet and very careful over those 3 years of walking, the way a hand goes careful around a burn that is not fully healed. She had learned to ask for work rather than charity, always, even when charity was plainly what she needed. Because a woman asking to earn her keep was harder for most men to turn away outright than a woman asking simply to be fed. And that small distinction, learned the hard way over many closed doors, was the only advantage she had left by the time she reached the Whitmore yard. Eli Turner, the ranch's youngest hand, at 19, was the only one who did not laugh that first afternoon. Or rather, he had laughed along in the yard because that was what a 19-year-old does among older men. But he had come by the kitchen twice on invented errands, and both times he had noticed things nobody else troubled to notice. He noticed that her hands, thin as the rest of her, were calloused and burn-scarred in the specific pattern of a person who had spent years at a hearth. Not the soft hands of somebody putting on an act. He noticed that she moved through an unfamiliar kitchen the way a person moves through a room they have lived in their whole life, without hesitation, without needing to hunt for anything twice. The second time he came by, she was tasting the bean pot with the back of a spoon, her eyes half closed in concentration, and he said, without quite meaning to, "You've done this before." It was not a question, either. Clara looked at him, this thin, serious boy, who had at least had the decency not to join the others in laughing with his whole chest, and said only, "A long time, and a long way from here." Eli nodded and went back to the corral, and he did not mention to the other hands what he had seen, mostly because he was not sure yet what he had seen, only that it did not match what Garrett had told everyone to expect. Garrett Cole himself came by the kitchen once that afternoon, ostensibly to check the wood supply, and found Clara at the range with the cast-iron door standing open, coaxing the fire down from a roar to a steady bed of coals with the flat of a shovel, the exact, careful patience that range demanded, and that Jasper Quinn had never once managed to give it. She did not look up. She was watching a skillet of cornbread batter set and rise at the edges, timing it by the sound and the sound of it more than by any clock on the wall. And when a coal popped and spat, and a bit of ash drifted dangerously close to the open beans, she caught it with the flat of the shovel before it landed. A motion so quick and so unremarkable to her that she had already gone back to the cornbread before Garrett had finished noticing it happen. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than his errand required, watching a woman handle a temperamental range the way a good rider handles a nervous horse, without drama, without wasted motion, and he left without saying anything at all, which for Garrett Cole was itself a kind of concession. Clara worked through the heat of the afternoon without pausing to rest, though her feet ached from 3 days of walking, and her hands had begun by midday to tremble slightly with a hunger she had not fully satisfied in longer than she cared to count. She had learned long ago not to eat from a pot she was cooking for other mouths, a rule her father had held to strictly, even in the leanest seasons at Harlan's Rest, on the theory that a cook who tasted her way to fullness before the guests sat down had already failed some quieter test of the work. She held to it now, out of habit more than principle, though the smell of the rendering pork fat tested her more than she let herself admit, and she thought, stirring the beans with the same steady patience she brought to everything, that if this single supper did not persuade Elias Whitmore, she would at least walk out of his yard the next morning having proven something to herself, which was that 3 years of closed doors had not managed to take the one skill she had left worth keeping. The kitchen had grown warm with the working of the range, and outside the window the shadows had begun to lengthen across the yard, and somewhere beyond the corral a meadowlark kept up its evening call, indifferent to the small, quiet contest playing out in the ranch's kitchen. A woman with nothing left to lose, cooking as if her whole life still depended on it, because in the particular way that mattered to her, it did. By late afternoon, the beans were dark and rich with the salt pork, thickened with a portion of the cornmeal she had toasted first in the rendered fat until it smelled of roasted corn rather than raw grain, sweetened just enough with the sorghum to round the edges without announcing itself as sweet. She made cornbread in 3 iron skillets using the rest of the fat, letting it develop a crust dark and cracked on the outside while staying tender within. A trick her father had taught her for stretching cornmeal into something closer to cake than mush. With the last of the dried apples softened and simmered with a spoonful of the molasses and a pinch of what turned out to be buried at the back of a shelf and forgotten, a twist of cinnamon bark that must have come west in somebody's trunk years earlier and never been used, she made a compote thick enough to spoon over the cornbread like a kind of poor man's cobbler. It was not a grand meal. She had nothing grand to make it from, but it was a meal cooked by someone who understood in her hands, if not always in her circumstances, exactly what she was doing. And the smell of it began around 5 o'clock in the afternoon to drift out across the ranch yard on the evening air in a way that burnt beans and scorched coffee had not managed to do in 2 weeks. Garrett Cole smelled it from the corral, where he was working a green colt that did not want working, and he told himself it meant nothing. That the woman had simply managed not to burn the beans, which was a low bar that Jasper Quinn himself had cleared most days before his hands went bad. He held that position for as long as he could, which was until the colt was put away, and he walked toward the bunkhouse for supper, and the smell hit him full in the chest. Rich and dark, and layered in a way that made something in his own stomach clench with a hunger he had not let himself feel fully in 2 weeks of eating food that was closer to punishment than sustenance. He came around the corner of the cookhouse and found most of the crew already there ahead of him, standing in a loose, uneven line, not saying much, the way men stand when they are hungry and trying not to look eager about it. Clara Bennett served from a plank table set up outside the kitchen door, since the ranch had no dining hall large enough for the full crew, and had always eaten in shifts on benches and upturned crates scattered around the yard. She ladled the beans dark and thick into tin plates, set a wedge of the cracked cornbread beside each portion. And for the first several men through the line, she said nothing at all, only served, her face composed and unreadable, betraying nothing of what she had spent the whole afternoon working to build. Hank was the first man to take a bite, mostly because he was too hungry to wait for manners, and the yard went for a moment entirely quiet, in a way it had not been quiet in 2 weeks, because Hank had stopped talking mid-chew, with an expression on his face like a man remembering something he had forgotten he missed. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Hank said, thickly, around a second bite already loaded onto his fork, "Lord above." That was all. That was enough. The line that had been shuffling forward with the resigned patience of men expecting more burnt beans began within a few minutes to move with an entirely different energy. And within 20 minutes of the first plate being served, the ranch yard of the Whitmore spread had gone from its usual grim silent, hurried supper into something closer to a celebration. Men talking with their mouths full, men trading compliments about cornbread with the seriousness usually reserved for horses or weather. And Elias Whitmore, watching from the porch of the main house with his own plate balanced on the rail, found himself smiling for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit. It was Eli Turner who finished his plate first and came back around for a second helping, not because he was performing anything for anybody, but because he was a growing 19-year-old who had genuinely never in his life eaten cornbread that good. And his second plate started something. One man following another man to the front of a line is a thing that happens on a ranch without much thought, the way cattle drift. And within another 10 minutes, there was a genuine informal queue reforming at the plank table of men who had already eaten a full plate and had decided without any embarrassment at all that they intended to eat another. Someone laughed a real laugh this time, not the mean kind from the yard that afternoon, and said that Jasper Quinn ought to be ashamed of himself wherever he'd got to. And someone else said that if this was what a ragged woman with dust on her boots could do with rendered pork fat and old cornmeal, he'd like to see what she could do with a full larder and a decent hog to work with. And by the time the light was going gray and gold over the west pasture, nearly every man on the Whitmore ranch had gone back for a second plate, and 2 or 3, Hank among them, had gone back for a third. The 2 hands who had been holding the horse herd out on the far side of the west pasture, too distant to have caught the smell any earlier, rode in at a lope when a third man was sent to fetch them, having been told only that supper was worth leaving the herd hobbled for, and they came around the bunkhouse corner at a near run. And one of them, a quiet older hand named Higgins, who had worked cattle for 20 years and rarely troubled himself to hurry for anything short of a stampede, was heard to say that he had not run toward a supper table since he was a boy of 10, and did not intend to make a habit of it, and then took a second plate anyway before his first was fully finished. Elias Whitmore, watching the whole ranch converge on that plank table the way cattle converge on a fresh water hole, thought that he had built this outfit over 12 hard years and had never once seen every last man on it in the same good mood at the same time. And he found he did not know quite what to do with the sight of it, beyond stand on his porch and watch it happen. Garrett Cole had not gone back for seconds. He had eaten his first plate in a silence that was noticeable to anyone paying attention, and he had said nothing about the food at all, which, on a night when every other man on the ranch was talking about nothing else, was its own kind of statement. He sat apart from the general clot of men near the table, his empty plate on his knee, and he watched Clara Bennett serve the last stragglers with the same steady, unhurried competence she had shown all afternoon. And something in him, something that had decided at first sight that a ragged woman in a worn-out dress could not possibly be worth the trouble of taking seriously, was working very hard against something else in him that had just eaten the best plate of beans and cornbread he had tasted in a decade of ranch cooking, most of it considerably worse than average. Clara noticed him not returning to the table. She noticed most things quietly, the way she noticed most things without making a display of the noticing. She did not go to him. She had learned a long time ago that a man in the particular grip of being wrong about something does not want to be approached about it, that the kindest thing you can do for such a man is to let him arrive at his own conclusion, in his own time, at his own pace, without an audience for the arriving. She finished serving the last of the crew, set aside a plate for herself smaller than the one she had served the men, out of a habit of restraint that had outlasted the years of genuine scarcity that first taught it to her, and she sat on an overturned crate near the kitchen door to eat it apart from the general gathering, the way she had learned to do at every ranch and relay station and boarding house she had ever cooked in, not quite belonging to the company she fed. It was Elias Whitmore who came to find her there, his own plate long finished, and he stood for a moment before he spoke, watching her eat with the same careful, unhurried economy she had cooked with. A woman who ate like someone who had gone hungry enough times to have made a kind of peace with food that most people who had never truly wanted for it could not understand. "That was the best meal that's come out of this kitchen since I built it 12 years ago," he said. "I want to be plain about that, since I was plain about the terms this morning. You've more than earned tomorrow's discussion." "Thank you," Clara said. "Where did you say your father's way station was?" "West of Fort Laramie, on the trail." She looked at her plate rather than at him while she said it. An old habit of not inviting further questions about a subject that still 3 years on cost her something to speak of. "We fed immigrant trains, army details, freight outfits, anybody moving west who needed a hot meal and a dry place to sleep. 14 years. Some seasons we fed 60, 70 people a day, all told across the whole day's traffic." She paused. It burned in the drought summer, along with most of what we'd stored against it. "My father did not survive the winter that followed. I've been working my way west since, looking for a kitchen that needed a cook badly enough not to ask too many questions about a woman traveling alone with nothing to her name." Elias Whitmore absorbed this the way he absorbed most things, without immediate comment, turning it over. "Well," he said, "finally you found one. This crew has been half feral for 2 weeks, eating food that would insult a hawk. You saw what they did with that table tonight. I don't imagine I need to tell you what it would mean to this outfit to have a cook who could do that every day, not just the one night she was trying to prove a point." "I would be glad of the work," Clara said. "I have been glad of very little lately." "I would be glad of that." He nodded, satisfied in the plain, unshowy way that men like Elias Whitmore were satisfied by most things. And he told her the cook's quarters, a small room off the kitchen that Jasper Quinn had occupied for a decade, were hers, starting that night, and that he would work out fair wages with her in the morning once his head was clearer than 2 weeks of poor sleep and worse food had left it. He thanked her again plainly and went back toward the main house, and Clara Bennett sat alone on her crate in the deepening blue evening, finishing a plate of food she had cooked with her own hands in a kitchen that, for the first time in 3 years, felt like it might actually be hers to keep. Garrett Cole came to find her the next morning before the crew had gathered for the day's branding work, while she was still setting bread to rise for the noon meal and stirring a pot of proper coffee, made from beans she had asked Elias for the previous night and roasted herself before dawn, rather than trust the ranch's exhausted, overground supply. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before she noticed him, and when she did not stop what she was doing, only glanced up and waited, the way she had learned to wait for men to say whatever they had worked up the nerve to come and say. "I owe you an apology," Garrett said, and it came out of him plainly, without much dressing up, the way an apology comes from a man who is not in the habit of giving many. "What I said to you yesterday about dust and prayer, that was unkind, and it was wrong. And I said it in front of the whole crew, which makes it worse, not better. You've more skill in that kitchen than any cook this ranch has had, and I judged you on a dress and a pair of worn boots before you'd said 10 words, and I have thought better of men for less than what you showed us last night, and I ought to know better than to think worse of a woman for it." Clara considered him for a moment, the coffee spoon still in her hand. "You were hungry and tired and had been eating burnt beans for 2 weeks, Mr. Cole," she said. "I have said unkinder things than that myself on worse days. I don't hold it against you. "I'd take it as a kindness, if you would, anyway," Garrett said. "Hold it against me a little. I earned that much." Something in the dry, unexpected honesty of it made the corner of Clara's mouth move. Not quite a smile, but close enough to it that Garrett Cole, watching for exactly that, felt something in his own chest ease considerably. "Well, she said there's a woodpile out back that wants splitting if a man's looking to earn back a little goodwill, instead of just asking for it plain." Garrett Cole looked at her for a moment, then laughed a real laugh, and said that seemed fair, and he went and split wood for the better part of an hour before the branding work called him away. More wood than the kitchen would need for a week stacked neat against the cookhouse wall, and he did not mention it to Clara again, and she did not thank him for it beyond a nod when she saw the pile. Because both of them understood, in the plain, unspoken way ranch people understood most things, that the wood had said what needed saying better than more words would have. Hank Brody came by the kitchen that same week with less ceremony than Garrett had managed, mostly because ceremony was not in Hank's nature, and simply said that a man who compared a hungry cook to a woman who looked like she needed feeding herself was a man who deserved to eat his own words along with his beans, and that he was sorry for saying it in front of the whole yard the way he had. Clara told him it was forgotten and meant it, and Hank seemed satisfied enough with that to go back to his work without further discussion, which suited them both. It was Eli Turner, though, who did Clara the quiet service of mentioning to Elias Whitmore a few days later, and without being asked, that he had noticed her hands the very first afternoon, calloused and scarred, in a pattern no faker could have put on, and that whatever the rest of the crew had assumed about a ragged woman walking in off the road, he had known by supper time that she was exactly what she claimed to be. Elias turned that over for a while, the way he turned most things over, and it settled something in him further about the wisdom of the chance he had taken. It was in the second week of September that a drifter came through the Whitmore yard, a thin man of perhaps 50, with a coat too light for the season, already turning cold at night, asking only whether there was work to be had for a meal, and getting from two hands loading a wagon nearby the same kind of look Clara herself had gotten a few weeks earlier. Tired men with little patience left over for strangers. Clara came out of the kitchen before anyone could send him on, and without a word about her own arrival, without needing to say that she recognized the particular tiredness in his face better than anyone else on that ranch could have. She set him a plate at the cookhouse table and told him to eat his fill before he worried about work, and that there would be a place in the hayloft if he needed it that night. Elias, watching from across the yard, did not interfere, and later that evening, when the drifter had gone on his way with a full stomach and a sack of provisions Clara had quietly put together for him, Elias only remarked that it seemed she had a habit of feeding people other folks were inclined to turn away. And Clara said only that she remembered plainly enough what it cost to be the one standing at the edge of a yard, and that she did not intend to forget it, just because her own circumstances had changed. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm the ranch had not had in longer than most of the hands could remember. Clara Bennett ran that kitchen the way her father had taught her to run one, which was with an economy that wasted nothing, and a generosity that made the wasting of nothing feel somehow like abundance rather than austerity. She sent Eli Turner out foraging for wild onion and the last of the summer greens along the creek bottom, taught him, without being asked, the difference between what was safe to gather and what was not, and he took to following her instructions with the earnest devotion of a boy who had found in a ranch full of hard, older men the first person in a long while who troubled to explain things to him properly. She kept a portion of every meal set aside quietly, without announcement, for the ranch dog, a rangy blue heeler named Bo, who had gone thin and skittish under Jasper Quinn's indifferent care, and who took within 2 weeks of Clara's cooking to sleeping across the threshold of the cookhouse door each night, as though he had appointed himself her personal guard, which, in his own animal way, he had. Elias Whitmore found himself as the branding week gave way to the ordinary business of late summer on a working cattle ranch, spending more of his evenings on the porch nearest the cookhouse than he had any particular reason to, watching the lamplight move behind the kitchen window as Clara finished her evening work, and telling himself it was only that a man appreciated good coffee, and did not mind saying so in person. He began asking her opinion on small household matters he would never have thought to ask Jasper Quinn about. Whether the root cellar wanted repair before winter, whether the ranch ought to keep more hens for eggs, given how the crew had taken to asking after them. And he found that her answers were considered and practical in a way that made him trust her judgment more broadly than he had expected to trust a stranger who had walked into his yard with nothing but a bundle and a story about a burned way station. There was an evening in October, the first genuine chill of the season settling over the ranch, when Elias came into the kitchen later than usual, having stayed out dealing with a stretch of fence a storm had knocked down, and found Clara at the table with a cup of tea, not doing any particular task, simply resting in the quiet after the kitchen was cleaned and the bread set to rise for morning. She looked up when he came in and told him there was supper kept warm if he wanted it, and he said he was hungry and sat, and she brought his plate, and for a while neither of them said very much. The comfortable kind of quiet that had grown up between them over 2 months without either one remarking on when exactly it had started. "I want to tell you something," Elias said, eventually setting down his fork. "And I am not a man who is good at saying things plainly when they matter most, so I'd ask you to bear with however this comes out." Clara waited, her hands folded around her tea. "When you walked into this yard in August, I was thinking about one thing only, which was whether this ranch was going to survive its own crew turning ugly on account of bad food. I was not thinking about you at all beyond whether you could solve that one problem for me. I have been thinking about you a good deal since, and none of it has to do with cornbread." He paused, looking Clara, thought faintly surprised at himself, the way a man looks when he has said something true he had not entirely planned to say, and is still catching up to having said it. "I don't quite know what to do with that, except to say it, and see what you make of it." Clara Bennett was quiet for a moment, turning her cup slowly on the table. "I came here a ragged woman nobody in that yard thought was worth a plate of food," she said. "I have spent 3 years being looked at and looked past, Mr. Whitmore, at every ranch and relay station between Fort Laramie and here. I did not come here looking for anything beyond a kitchen and a roof. I want you to understand that plainly before I say anything else." She looked at him directly, which she did not often do, having learned caution about it the hard way. "But I have not felt looked past in this kitchen. Not by you, and not most days by that whole ungrateful crew of yours, who I notice have started calling this cookhouse the best-run building on the property, louder than they'll admit to my face." A small, dry warmth crept into her voice. "I would not be unhappy, Elias, if whatever you are working up the nerve to say took its time arriving. I find I am not in any hurry these days. It has been a long while since I could say that about anything." Elias Whitmore laughed, low and real, the sound of a careful man, setting a little of his carefulness down. "Then I expect we understand each other," he said for now, "and I will not push it further than that tonight." And they sat together a while longer in the warm kitchen, the lamp burning low, the ranch quiet around them, Bo asleep across the threshold, and neither of them said anything more about it, because neither of them needed to. Some things Clara had learned a long time ago at her father's hearth are better shown than told, and are better still simply lived, day by ordinary day, until the living of them says everything that needed saying. By the time the first hard frost came to the Whitmore ranch in November, the kitchen Clara Bennett ran had become, without anyone quite deciding it should, the actual heart of the operation, more than the branding pens or the bunkhouse, or even Elias Whitmore's own office where the ranch's books were kept. Hands who had once laughed at a ragged woman's offer to cook now lingered in that kitchen on their off hours the way men linger somewhere they feel without needing the word for it at home. Garrett Cole had taken to bringing her the choicest cuts whenever a beef was slaughtered for the ranch's own table, a small, silent, ongoing penance. He never called by that name, and she never asked him to. Eli Turner could, by winter, make a passable pot of beans himself, taught patiently over slow autumn afternoons by a woman who had decided that knowledge, unlike food, only grew larger the more of it you gave away. And every evening without fail, when supper was called across the yard, There was invariably, without anyone remarking on it as unusual anymore, a line for seconds. A hard storm blew through in late January, the kind that shut the ranch indoors for 3 days running, and it was Clara who kept the crew fed through it on stores she had been quietly setting aside since October. The same provisioning her father had drilled into her on the trail, where a train caught short in bad weather could lose lives as easily as cattle. She rationed nothing that felt like rationing, stretched what she had with the same unshowy skill she had brought to that first meager supper in August. And by the time the storm broke, the men who had eaten hot food twice a day through all of it understood, without further proving, exactly what kind of cook had walked into their yard 5 months earlier. Garrett Cole said, on the morning the sky cleared, that he had stopped counting the times he had been wrong about her. And Elias Whitmore, digging a path to the cookhouse door, thought privately that he had stopped counting a good while before Garrett had. It became in time a kind of standing joke on the ranch, repeated at the supper table until it had worn smooth and comfortable, the way old jokes do, that the surest measure of whether Clara Bennett had gotten a new recipe right was not the first plate any man cleaned, but whether he came back around for a second one before she'd even finished serving the line. Elias Whitmore, who by the following spring had stopped pretending to anyone, least of all himself, that his evenings on the porch nearest the cookhouse were about the coffee, took to being first in that second line most nights. A fact the crew noted, and with the particular restrained good humor of ranch hands who liked their boss and liked their cook a great deal more, mostly kept to themselves. Clara Bennett, ladling out a second plate for the man who had once told his foreman one meal to prove herself, thought sometimes of the yard in August, the laughing the boots worn through, the 4 days without coffee, and found she did not need to forgive any of it particularly, because it had led her 1 ragged mile at a time to a kitchen that was at long last entirely and unmistakably her own, and to a table where a second plate was never a question, only every single evening certainty.